Hello, my name is Melissa DePaulis, and I am the events coordinator here at Busboys. Welcome. We are very excited to welcome Bernice King this evening, and we're so glad that you could join us. Just a little bit about Busboys. How many of you are here for the first time? Here in her own right. Bernice is the youngest daughter of Coretta Scott King and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She began her oratorical journey when she spoke in her mother's stead at the United Nations at the age of 17. In 2007, Bernice founded Be a King, whose mission is to rebrand and re-image generations of people to elevate the way they think, act, live, and lead. Through Be a King, she is working to develop a nation of young people who will impact the global marketplace and transform the world culture with a kingdom mindset. The book being featured this evening, Desert Rose, The Life and Legacy of Coretta Scott King, was written by Coretta King's only sister, Edith Scott Badgley, who died shortly after the book was completed. It's available for purchase, as I mentioned before, in our Global Exchange store for $36.11 including tax. And for Badgley, the book had become a lifelong quest to tell the story of her sister's rise from rural Alabama to the heights of American history as the wife of civil rights legend Martin Luther King Jr. And now, without further ado, to talk more about the book and the amazing legacy of Coretta Scott King, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Bernice King.
Well, thank you very much, Melissa, right? Yeah. Okay. I want to thank all of the staff at Busboys and Poets for this wonderful opportunity, and thank all of you all for being here and listening on this evening. I'm, of course, from Atlanta, Georgia. I call it the greatest city on the face of the earth, next to your city, of course. And I want to just share a little bit about this special book, Desert Rose, The Life and Legacy of Coretta Scott King. Some of you know, perhaps if not most of you know, my mother passed on January 30th, 2006. About a year or so after her passing, my aunt, her sister, told me she had been working on a book on the life and legacy of my mother. She said, "We've got to get some things out there about Coretta because people really don't know the strength of your mother, the determination and the courage and the sacrifice that she made. She was not just Dr. King's wife and the mother of her children. She was not a grieving widow who just decided, oh well, let me just continue his work. But she very much was intricately involved in the movement and came from very strong spiritual roots, grounded very strongly in a very industrious family who was committed to community and education. And people need to know about her life story. And so, as she began to share that story with me, I said, well, can I help you kind of get it published? Because my aunt at the time, I think, was somewhere around the age of 80, 81. And I knew she, in her own power, would not be able to do anything to translate what she had written into a published book. And so we began that journey together. She was doing some finishing touches on the book, and she started telling me, you know, I started this book in 1966. I said, really? She said, yes, your mother insisted that I write a book about her life story. And I think it was probably because she wanted people to know that she was more than just his wife and his companion, but that she was truly a co-partner, intricately involved in the movement. And secondly, so that people would know that women were very instrumental in the movement. We hear a lot about the men, they're highlighted, and so this book is very critical. So she started that journey in 1966, and lo and behold, on April 4th, she put it in the mailbox to a publisher. And of course, Daddy was assassinated later that evening. One of the reasons that she was encouraged by my mother to write the book is because, as you probably well know, studying that time period in history, my mom and dad, and of course us as well, even though we didn't know it, lived under constant threat. And so she didn't know if she would live from day to day, and she was entrusting that task to her sister. So when Daddy was assassinated, of course, Mother had some time to really sit with herself and said, well, I want to kind of do my own story at this point. And she, at that time, wrote a book entitled My Life with Martin Luther King Jr., which is right now out of publication. And so Aunt Edith kind of shelved it and went on with her life. She was actually a professor at Cheney State University in Cheney, Pennsylvania. She started the drama department there in the early 70s and taught well into the mid-90s. And so in 2004, she was visiting with my mother in Atlanta, Georgia, and my mother said, you know, you really need to finish that book. Ironically, my mother had been working herself on her memoir, but it just never materialized. So I think she felt something in her own spirit that this book that Aunt Edith was working on, that she had already seen some of the pages of the story, was probably closer to being completed than the memoir she had been working on. And perhaps, I don't know, there's some people I believe that have some kind of feeling that they may not be here but so long. And I don't know if my mother had that, but it just seems so ironic that she did kind of push my aunt forward to do this project. And so she encouraged her once again to work on it, and that's how this whole story unfolded. And of course, in '66, it was a different story than in 2006, 7, and 8. And so she began to work on the latter parts of Mother's life while we were talking and discussing about getting her a publishing deal. And so that's how Desert Rose came to be. I want to read something that Aunt Edith wrote in the book about the title, because people keep asking me why the title Desert Rose. If you think about some of the conditions that many African Americans grew up in the South, pretty restricting conditions, pretty dry and difficult circumstances. When you really look at the life that my mother lived and was fortunate to be able to be raised in a family, in a community that nurtured and developed her into being a world leader, that's how this title was derived. And so this is what Aunt Edith said in her own words. She said, the title Desert Rose was derived from my knowledge of the region and culture in which Coretta and I were born and reared. We grew up under the harsh and withering restrictions of the Jim Crow South. Coretta was determined through education, art, faith, and social activism to do all she could to create a better life for herself, her family, and people around the world. In so doing, her life was like a rose pushing up from the parched, dry ground and springing forth in a beautiful blossom. And so that's what this book is really about. It chronicles my mother's life from her birth, obviously, since Aunt Edith was there when she was born. She's 2.5, close to 3 years older than my mom, and talks about her carrying that legacy after my father. But in between, and this is very important because we just dedicated the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in October of last year. And one of the things that saddened me at that time is that my mother could not physically be there to see the monument, although she was involved in the early stages when the plans were being made. And so as I sat there, I thought about the fact that this memorial never would have materialized had it not been for the consistent and the persistent daily work of Coretta Scott King after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Because although many people today love and admire Daddy, in fact he's the most loved man in the world, in 1968 when he was killed, he was one of the most hated men in America. And that's probably hard to imagine for certain people under a certain age, because all they know is the Martin Luther King that's been touted and the I Have a Dream and other things that people are now discovering about Daddy. And he's this wonderful person. But he was not a wonderful person to a lot of people during his lifetime, because he was really focused on ridding our world of what he called the triple evils of poverty, racism, and materialism. And those were the same kind of values and concerns that our mother had as well. So when they met up, he was not teaching her. She was not necessarily teaching him. But they were two people who grew up in these very restricting circumstances, but have been prepared through their life circumstances and education exposure in particular, that really brought them together to lead this movement. By the time Mother met Dad in 1952, she had already studied Mahatma Gandhi, who was one of the greatest influencers of my father's philosophy of nonviolence. Of course, Daddy had studied him by that time as well. She was an activist in her own right, as you'll discover in this book. And I like to tell this story because it's alluded to in the book, that when my mother was at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, she went there because she felt that if she got out of the South to a more liberal arts kind of college, college that was devoted to helping to raise the social consciousness of the students, that she would be able to take advantage of opportunities she never could in the South. And so when she got to the time for her to do her student teaching, she completed the first part of it, but the second part of it required students to teach in the school system right there in Yellow Springs. The school system, however, was not integrated. And so they basically told my mother she could not do her student teaching there, so she began to try to get support from her fellow students and was unsuccessful with that. She then approached the president of the university, who was a new president at that time, and he basically turned her down and said, "There's nothing that I can do." Very disappointed, obviously. She said, "You know, I'm going to compromise now, but I don't have to live with this." And believe it or not, my mother completed all of her classwork. She couldn't do the student teaching, and she did not get her degree at that particular time because of that. Because she refused to give in and teach at the all-segregated school in Xenia, Ohio. She later got the degree they gave it to her, obviously, by 1965, 66. And I'm sure they had egg on their face by that time. But that's one of the stories I like to tell. But I want to read a couple of other things.